Welcome to Phil Wilson Chats with Celebrities. And here's your host, Phil Wilson.
July 2025 sees the 50th anniversary of Grammy and Brit Award winning producer Steve Levine, whose career in the music industry started at CBS Studios in 1975. Steve has engineered the sound of many new wave and pop acts of our generation, and today is working with new talent Maevey and MT on his new Baltic Jazz Recordings label. And Steve joins us now to tell us all about it. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm very well, Phil.
It's great to have you on the show. And yes, I've been fascinated by everything that you've done and all of your achievements, and also who you've been working with as well. Now, have you always been passionate about music from a young age?
Yes, I think from a very, very early age. I think from maybe around 5 or 6, I was always fascinated by the records I heard both on the radio, and my mum's friend, who was Jamaican, Rita, she had a lot of Jamaican records because her husband still was working in Jamaica, even though Jamaican independence had happened a few years earlier. So I had all these early, what we now know as reggae records, but they were actually ska in those days. And a lot of early Motown. Some of the Motown was released, as you know, in America, and they had access in Jamaica well before they made their way to the UK. And so I had this fascinating kind of oral pleasure of these really unusual records. And if you remember back to that 60s period, you had the Beatles just beginning to make their waves. You had Phil Spector, you had lots of ballads and show tunes and all these things. And then in amongst it were these, incredible Motown records. Or it was a fascinating. So for me, growing up, it was just the sound of those records. Why did they all sound so different?
It's just amazing how it's all to do with the production and everything, isn't it? It's that when you hear a Motown record, there's that distortion which is always there, and it's like, was that intentional? To have the VU meters going like.
Well, I think
maximum,
Well, I now know what it was because many years ago I was very fortunate to have Hollandosia Holland as my guests on my radio, the record producers, and they very kindly gave me some of their original Motown recordings, so I know exactly what the issues were, and they have a distinctive sound. I think each period in history, and particularly in America, where state to state, very little was, we didn't have the internet in those days. So what went on in Detroit, which is where Motown was very different to what went on in Los Angeles or New York or Nashville or any other part of America. So the studios themselves often designed their own equipment, and it stayed within the state. So the Motown studio has custom equipment. But then if you go to what was going on in New York, for example, Bell Studios, that was their own equipment. What was going on in the West Coast was their own equipment. So there was very little sharing of that information. And then they all had local musicians. So that contributed enormously to the distinct sound of the, which I now know. At the time, I didn't know, but I know now that's what contributed to the very distinct sound between those different records.
And I think that the chart, in any case, if everybody had been singing off the same hymn sheet, as it were, then it wouldn't have been so interesting because you wouldn't have all these different sounds. No, everybody would be like, same old, same old.
And I think, when you look at, there's plenty of magazines that have legacy charts from those periods. And it's incredible when you look at a chart from even actually sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, you'll see a contemporary act. And then you'll see a cabaret lounge act. I mean, it was just, the charts used to be much more eclectic than they are now.
Very much so as well. But we're going to be picking up from some of those fabulous artists that you've worked with a little bit later on. Now, what was it that drew you to apply to work in the music world?
Well, I think when I was at school, the fascination of how records sounded extended to the next phase of my life. So as a teenager, I had a cassette machine very early on, and it was kind of quite a revolutionary thing at school. When I took it to school, it was like having, I guess it must have been the latest iPhone, for example. It was quite a wow factor. So with the cassette machine, I was able to record stuff. and I started experimenting, both recording stuff on the radio, which was illegal in those days.
Yeah. Everyone did
Well,
it.
I know, it's
Everyone
like
did
one of those
it.
big things. It's illegal to, but I used to. But what I was using was, a method of recording it so that I could hear some stuff back. I bought everything that I wanted, and then I would
Yeah.
actually copy my records onto cassette so that they didn't wear out, because I was very aware
Yeah.
of crackles and pops. So as soon as I got a record, I did a pristine transfer to cassette, so I would have it on a cassette, so I'd listen to it
Yeah.
over on cassette and not wear the record out. And I then started experimenting, because the cassette machine came with a little microphone, and I remember starting to experiment with recording stuff. And then when I got to school, senior school, I was very excited by the fact we had a separate physics and electronics department, and I just started to really focus on that. And I had a great teacher who helped me develop those skills, and I ended up making my own disco unit, as it was called then, with two
Wow.
the deck
Yeah.
the decks I bought, but the amplifier, the preamp, and all the lighting stuff we built from parts, because in those
Wow.
there were magazines like Electronics Today, and you could buy all the parts that you needed. They kind of so it was like a kit, and I, with his help, we made what was for the time a pretty good, and I was good at metalwork as well, so I was able to go into the metalwork room and use plexiglass, that perspex stuff.
Yes. Yes.
Out, so it looked quite professional.
Excellent.
So I did, and then I used to do the school disco, the end of term discos, and then as we moved towards the later years and bands started emerging at school, I would help, do the sound and everything. But I always then was fascinated by the fact that the disco would be the disco, and then the band would come on, and they would sound quite rubbish at school because PAs in those terrible. And then I come back on with the disco, and everyone preferred the disco. So again, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, how can this be improved?
Yes. Oh, yes. You started very early there. Now, did you actually have any other jobs before going into the music industry?
I left school on a Friday, and I started at CBS Studios on a Monday in July 1975. So my entire life has been in recording studios. I had a Saturday job in a menswear shop, which when I was still at school. So I also had some quite nice clothes with the staff discount. But I've never done any other job other than been in the music industry.
That's absolutely amazing as well. And you've worked with some of the most well-known artists and bands in the music business, but you did have humble beginnings at CBS Records in 1975, which I hear was based actually on what they used to call the Electronics Capital Street, which was Tottenham Court Road. And I went to Ask Electronics and bought a Betamax tape from there many years back.
Hey, you're right. Tottenham Court Road had Lasky Electronics. It had all of those great, and I mean, there are a few left, but yes. So CBS Studios is on Whitfield Street, which is just, if anyone knows where Goodge Street Tube Station is, it's literally behind Goodge Street Tube Station. And it was at the time, one of the first purpose-built recording studios. It wasn't an office, it's now an office block, but it was actually built as a recording studio, not as an office block converted.
Right.
So it had 3 studios, and what the policy was then was that Studio 1 was a big studio, like an orchestral size studio. Studio 2 was the sort of rock and roll studio. And Studio 3 was the smaller studio, which was initially equipped with the sort of leftovers from the other studios. So as upgrades were made in Studio 1 and Studio, the equipment went upstairs. So it became a kind of demo studio. And that transpired that the punk generation was coming through, who wanted to have that kind of DIY feel to their music. So it worked well. And CBS Records was also just off Tottenham Court Road, but in Soho Square, so a 5-minute walk. So what would happen was the A&R executives at the record company would often see a band, and bearing in mind at this time the punk and new wave world was very London centric. A lot of bands were playing Camden Town, Hammersmith. There's like 2 or 3 big venues, and up in King's Cross. King's Cross wasn't developed then, so there were lots of pub venues. So a band would get a decent amount of pub gigs across London. Even the Hope Anchor. So if an A&R executive went to see a band at one of those what are now famous venues, they obviously couldn't hear exactly what was going on. So they would offer them a day of free studio time in Studio 3. And that's how come myself and Simon Humphrey would. So Simon was a couple of years older than me and had already transitioned up into assistant engineer and then became an engineer, as I was tape op ready to go to assistant engineer and then engineer. So on one of those demo sessions, you'd have essentially a junior engineer and a tape op, because we could then learn our craft while it was a non-risk session. They weren't paying for the time. And if the record company decided to not release the band, they would be free to take those master tapes and use them to get another deal. So, for example, The Clash were one of the very first bands we worked with, and did sign them. But another band, for example, XTC, who we also worked with. In fact, looking at the timeline, I believe, because we did 2 sessions with XTC, we actually did XTC first, and then The Clash original sessions, and then another XTC session. But XTC were not signed by CBS. They used those very same tapes to go and get their deal with Virgin Records.
Yeah.
And there were other bands within that were kind of more, if you like, more finished. So the Vibrators, we never did demos. They were immediately a record. A band called The Drones that we also did a record with. Then there were bands like The Only Ones, and they were kind of, we did some demos but turned into masters. So it varied on how CBS's involvement was with the actual bands themselves. And for The Clash, we did, the original sessions included White Riot, and then we carried on recording with them, and we recorded all the first album with Simon engineering and me assisting. And then as things expanded and we got to things like White Man in Hammersmith Palais, which was the very last recording that we did with The Clash. They obviously went more, but that was the last one that they did at CBS Studios. We actually split those sessions between Studio 1 and Studio 2 because Mick Jones wanted to put piano and harmonica on the track. So I was working downstairs with him recording the piano because I had a better piano in Studio 2. And Simon was working with Joe upstairs on a couple of the other tracks that they were working on at the time, which was, they actually did do a great version of Time Is Tight, and I think Joe was doing some guitars on it. So we split so we could do kind of 2 things at once.
Excellent. And did you work on Rock the Casbah?
No. That was well after the time.
That was well after where your
White Man in Hammersmith Palais was the last, but that was the first set of sessions that involved Topper Hayden, or Topper Head. So the first album was Terry Chimes on drums, but then after that, Topper Hayden came in on board as drummer. But interesting with Topper, I'd actually worked with him separately to that. So before that, Topper was actually kind of around London, was a session drummer. He'd been, so I actually have Topper performances on some other clients where I was just an engineer and the producer, because he's a really good drummer. So there's a few sessions that he did around London before, joining the Clash. And he was obviously a great fit for the Clash because as they moved forward, and Topper's a great musician. I mentioned White Man in Hammersmith Palais. It's Topper playing the piano on that track. And and you mentioned Rock the Casbah, nothing to do with me, but I do know that Topper played a lot of the instruments on that track.
And it gets a
musician,
very good musician there. Excellent. Now, as a tape op, what did it entail exactly? Were you responsible for the cutting and sticking of recordings together and making chinograph marks for the edits? Or was that left to other people?
No. Look. And I still do it now. There's a chinograph pencil.
There you go, the famous chinograph.
So, yes, you're absolutely correct. The role of the tape op was as follows. Get there very early and turn the tape machines on. They weren't valve, they were transistor by the time I got there. I wasn't on 4-track. I started on 16-track and it moved to 24-track, but they were solid state electronics. The studio still did have 2 4-track Studios that were valve. There's similar models to the ones the Beatles used to use, but they were literally used for tape echo and copying. They'd been, kind of, obviously they'd be so valuable now, but they were literally in the corner not doing anything. If you look at any of those pictures, you'll see those machines in the corner, whereas the 16-track or 24-track was prominent. But you'd turn the machine on, put a fresh reel of tape on, and you'd have to put test tones on the tape and line all that up. You'd also then help the assistant engineer and the engineer set the studio up. Because there was sometimes 2 on a session, sometimes 3. If it was a big session, you'd have tape op, assistant, and engineer. If it was a smaller session, it'd be just tape op / assistant and engineer. And so you'd help set the mics up. The engineer would obviously set the balances. and then you would be very much in charge of the track split, as it was called then. So which thing was recorded on what track, and also track management, as in the days of 16 track, you had to be really careful where you put things because you would run out of tracks really quickly. And although you could copy from one track to another to get more tracks, you couldn't copy from track 1 to track 2. You'd have to copy from track 1 to track 3. You had to leave you couldn't, as it's called, you couldn't copy on adjacent tracks when you were
Right.
because you'd get a tiny little bit of feedback. So you have to try and avoid that. That's why, people used to sort of be very careful where they spread the track. So, for example, you'd often put the bass drum or kick drum on track 1 because that was right on the edge, and it didn't matter if it got a little bit damaged because there's no high fidelity frequencies on that. The top end on a kick drum is not that great. It's mainly the low. And often if you were doing other things like we started with automation, and there was often a time code, and we'd sometimes put that on track 24 or track 16 just to keep it
right.
But then the big skill was what we call punching in. So if somebody would make a mistake with an overdub, particularly vocals, you tend to not do, if you're doing the backing track and they did 2 or 3 takes, then as you said earlier, you would listen to take 1 and you'd kind of go graph mark, get the razor blade out and cut it into the other. We did that a lot. There was a lot of editing. I did some tracks where you'd play the tape and you'd go if you did a lot of editing, very often you would actually do a multi-track copy of the tape just to save the edits, because the edits sometimes would come undone, and also it was very noisy when you wound it back. So and because the studio possessed at least 3 machines, you would overnight patch it from studio 3, for example, into studio 2 and do a multi-track copy, so you don't have a fresh piece of tape. It was a second generation, but considering the number of cuts on it depended on the band. Some cuts were a lot, some it was just literally one cut from one to the other. Or on 1 or 2 occasions, if there were very different arrangement sections in the song, so if there was, say, a middle 8 that had an a cappella thing, you might record that separately and then join it together when you came to mix.
Right.
And then, of course, as I mentioned, the punching in. So if somebody was singing a vocal and they got to the chorus and made a mistake, you'd wind back the tape, get ready and punch in. And in those days, unlike computers, that was it. If you went in to record early, you wiped it, and if you were late, and also in those days you couldn't punch out very quickly because as the tape's moving, the gap between the erase head and the record head was about that. Are we on?
Wow.
We're on camera.
Yeah.
People can
yes,
see.
we are. Yes.
So what's that, like 4 inches? So it meant that if you weren't quick enough, the bit coming in would get wiped.
Oh my goodness gracious me!
You have to be really, really sharp like that.
See, it wasn't as easy as it is these days. Just
lucky they are. Yeah.
Yes, you certainly had the skill there, and
But the thing is, Phil, that skill, looking at the locating point as to where you're going to cut, thinking about how you're going to cut, nothing has changed in a digital workstation. The same brain pattern happens. I look at something and think, I'm just going to change that. I was working on something the other day where we did the verse and we decided to extend the verse. Same brain pattern. Okay, where's the kick drum? Right, I can move that to there, do a line, so I'm not using a Chinograph pencil on a DAW, but I'm doing the same work. And then very occasionally, if I do have something with tape, because I have got some tape machines and I do it's actually, what I would tend to cut today is more if I'm working with a band and we're doing some more ambient stuff, and we might make a tape loop of some weird sounds. That's more likely what I do the cut, because you'd be making like a loop of something,
Yes. Absolutely amazing it is, isn't it? The technology, how things have moved on. Now, did you ever have any mishaps doing that job? Did you ever have any moments where you went,
there's one that I can remember. So CBS Studios, I mentioned, was on Whitfield Street, and the wall of the studio was the facing wall. There were no windows, but that was where the street was. And in those days, because of Tottenham Court Road and the tube station being the next thing, minicabs would sometimes park in the street.
So you hear the tick, tick, tick of the engine.
No, worse than that. If you were actually in record and a minicab was literally physically right outside the wall, it sometimes went on tape. And there was one occasion where the band were just coming to the last chord of the song. So we were recording the backing track, and you heard, POB. And that literally went across all the tracks. So what we
Oh
had,
no.
I know it was terrible. That happened. So what we and that was the master take. So what we had to do was individually. It was the end of the song. So
Yeah.
individually, then the guitarist had to go blang and then wipe that track,
And that.
and the drummer had to go, and then we had to wipe that
Yeah.
track and go through each track individually to get rid of that. Yeah. So yes.
Hey, that is absolutely amazing.
Not me, but I had an assistant on a session, and I had a senior engineer, and this was in Studio 3, and we did a jazz session, 100% live, vibraphone, singer, upright bass, straight to stereo, live, which was quite common in those days, by the way.
Yeah.
That wasn't done for economic reasons. That was done because they just wanted to capture it live. There's no point in mixing it, and the quality of going directly to 30 IPS was great. And in those days, you would have, the reels themselves were actually quite expensive, the empty reels. So we would often archive those. So if we did a session and used up, say, 3/4 of the reel, you would either keep the other half for another session, or if you'd used a lot of the reel, you just put a razor blade through it and keep the reel, because the empty reel was more valuable than, an inch of, that much tape.
Of course.
So what happened was we recorded the song or the track, and there was a bit of tape left, maybe that much.
Yeah.
And the tape op put the razor blade through the wrong half.
Oh, no.
And put it in the bin.
Oh, no.
Now, luckily, it was all done with one swift cut. So we pulled it out the bin, laid it on the mixing console, and put it all back together again before the client realized what had happened. And
oh my goodness.
We did a copy of that so that they couldn't see the splices.
What a mistake to make, as they say.
Yes, exactly.
Hey, that's amazing. Well, I love that story. A very expensive story.
Exactly.
It could have been worse.
All night doing it, yes, yeah.
Imagine it. Oh my goodness, yeah. Because you've obviously the musicians as well. Sometimes back in the day, you only had them for the day, and they would get the pay packet at the end, and you couldn't say come back again, because that's more money, and you're never going to get the same recording again twice. That feel and things. And
well, that's why another part of the experience I had was on orchestral sessions, because you're right, the orchestra was very expensive. So with the orchestra, they would just play all day. And then you'd have, on a classical session, you actually had two additional people. You had the classical producer and you had the classical editor. So that was a producer who was able to read the score and would make marks on the score during the sessions. And then after the session, sometimes the same day, depends on, but generally speaking, it was a second or third day, they would go through and they'd say, okay, Steve, we want take 7 bars, blah-de-blah to blah-de-blah. And so they'd make it, because obviously they would go through the score and there would be mistakes and you'd edit it together. So that was quite a clever and skillful job. I don't read music. I still can't read music, but you'd have a person saying it's bar whatever. I obviously can count bars. And so you go through and they'd say, okay, it's there. And then this is where the skill was, because in those days you wouldn't cut with a razor blade, you'd often use scissors. So for example, if the classical editor would say, right, okay, we want this bar to this bar from take whatever it is. And if it, for example, the opening note of the bit we're going to edit in had a flute on it, for example, you would then edit a very slow angle, as opposed to normally you cut at say 45 degrees, so it just go through. But if you had a flute or a very quiet passage coming in, you'd edit it by having a very long cut so that it crept in against the other one, because with the orchestra playing live in the room, you've got ambience to consider. So that became a really great skill. That's something that, in a DAW today, the crossfade, but it's essentially you're making a physical crossfade by cutting it very slowly or with a very, very kind of shallow angle.
That's amazing. That
again, a skill carried to this day.
Definitely. Now, you progressed to be an in-house engineer and worked with, as you've mentioned, new wave, punk and pop acts, including The Clash, The Jags, The Vibrators, XTC and Sailor. Now, what was it like working with these groups, as The Clash and XTC seemed quite wild?
Well, yes, that was our punk thing. So then we generated forward, and I'd worked on Sailor's demos, so they'd had all the hits, Glass of
Yeah,
Champagne, Girls, and Sailor was the next sort of big thing for me to. I'd had worked also with a band called Up, which was very enjoyable and taught me a lot, produced by Christopher
right,
Bond. Then I worked with Hudson Ford again.
right,
These are contemporary tracks that really taught me my skill. Sailor was interesting because we did all the demos, as I mentioned, but the third album, Bruce Johnson got to produce that. Bruce Johnson from the Beach Boys, and it was Bruce that then
right.
said, "You're developing really well as an engineer. You should become a record producer."
Absolutely amazing. Yes, and of course, Bruce definitely was a person who influenced you into producing an album for them as well 7 years later. Please, can you tell us the story behind that one?
During the Sailor sessions, Bruce kept encouraging me to offer creative input, as in, for example, a lot of Sailor's work uses synthesizers, and so he'd say, "Oh, Steve, let's try this particular sound with with a synth, or maybe we can try this echo," and really try to be very creative in the way things were, and try some effects, because they're great musicians and great singers, but it's the detail. He said to me, "Why don't you come to California and work on some of my records?" Because at the time, Bruce was a very big deal producer. He had a lot
Yes,
of success. He was actually at that time more successful than Brian, because he'd had "I Write the Songs" was a Grammy-winning song, and people
wow.
he was an in-demand producer.
Yes,
So I went with him to California and worked on a few of his different projects that he had going on at the time, and that taught me an awful lot. So that when I came back, I was ready to, really enhance my career as a music producer. And then, as you say, a number of years later, the Beach Boys were about to sign a new deal with Jimmy Guercio and Caribou Records, and Bruce phoned me and said, "Look, we really would love you to produce us," because at that time I now had the success with Culture Club, and so
yes,
CBS Records in America distributed Culture Club's records rather than Virgin.
right. Yeah,
So essentially, they said, "Come to, let's have a meeting and let's discuss it." And so it was very much as a sort of return gesture, a thank you for the mentoring that I'd had earlier. And of course, my own reputation was now worth them kind of bankrolling me to do it. And it was a very, amazing period in my life, because I wasn't that old, and also I'm now, as people have pointed out to me, I'm the only other producer to produce the Beach Boys other than Brian Wilson, which is quite an accolade.
it definitely is as well. Absolutely amazing as well. And was it, and when you were producing them, was that when they had that single which was featured in Cocktail? I can't remember the song. It's very
No,
famous.
you're talking about Kokomo, but that was after.
Kokomo. Oh, it was afterwards.
That was
Oh, right. I
immediately
see.
after our sessions. They didn't have that song. That was a commission. But my song that I did do, "Get Your Back," was featured in the Herbie film. Herbie
Oh,
Strikes Again, or
right.
Herbie Reload, whatever. I can't remember which is the title. One of the Herbie films. The entire
Yes.
beginning is "Get Your Back."
Excellent, excellent. But yes, that is definitely an accolade there, to be one of the only other people to produce the Beach Boys. But a little Dickie Beard has been speaking to me, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, which may mention something to do with the Beach Boys coming soon. Now, the first song you produced outright was with Magnet Records, I hear. Who was the artist and what was the song?
Benny Lord, "Faithful to the Fiancé." And that was his
Excellent.
stage name. His real name is Christopher Knott. And yes, you're absolutely right. That was the very first record. I got a call from Magnet Records, and Simon and I were busy doing Jags. He was also working with Secret Affair. I was also working with a guy called John Howard. We were working on lots of different things. And so, for example,
Yeah,
John Alder, the guitarist in the Jags, Simon worked on the Jags, but then John played some guitar for me on some of my sessions, and
right.
Simon was working with Secret Affair. But essentially, what was happening is we were doing lots of stuff around town, and everyone was kind of thinking they're the guys to have. So we were hired as a sort of team to do Chris Knott or Benny Lord, and the record came out. It was medium successful, but it formed a relationship with Chris which lasts to this day. I saw him only a couple of nights ago at our celebration at the Liverpool Philharmonic.
Excellent. Beautiful. What was it like at the Philharmonic then?
fantastic. It was really, really good. I'm so pleased with. I was obviously very apprehensive of it,
Yeah.
and it was a fabulous audience. An audience of Beach Boy fans, Culture Club
Wow.
fans, a few kind of techie fans. Yeah, it was really lovely. It was a very, very warming evening. And Katie Puckrick, the host, did a tremendous job because you need to have someone that has the same sort of history, same background, but
Yeah.
also because she's American, she has it from a slightly different perspective. It was a fabulous event, and hopefully we can do some more because we could have gone on all night and it was sold out. And I think, having looked at what we've done, we could probably do it again.
Excellent. And was it recorded at all on
Oh
video?
no, absolutely not. That was just privately for me, but yes, it wasn't intended to do that. We may do some things later. Who knows?
Yes, because that would be something for all to see. Absolutely magical.
But then that's the same as, comedians that do the live circuit. They don't really want their stuff video because once it's videoed, it's out there. Whereas if everybody goes
Well, that's true.
live, and it also isn't scripted, so there's an element of movement which is very enjoyable.
Yeah, and you can have you can have audience participation
Oh, we
if you
did.
wanted
We
that,
did a
and
Q&A.
questions and answers if you want.
Absolutely. So my idea for this would be it worked very well what we did. So hopefully, if I can find an agent or people that do those tours, then maybe because there's a lot of people doing these in conversations around the country.
Yes.
That then begins to make financial sense because it's a lot of effort to do. But I would be keen on doing something like that. I just need to find the right booking agent to do it because that's not the kind of thing I do. That's out of my scope. This particular one we did direct with the Liverpool Phil, so it's fine.
But yes, we'll watch out for that coming soon, hopefully, Steve. That would be absolutely
Any
wonderful.
agents watching, get in touch.
That's right. Get in touch with Steve Levine. Yes, that would be fabulous. Now, the next chapter in your career was producing Culture Club's classic hits and the band's 3 multi-platinum albums, including the famous Colour-By numbers. What was it like working with Boy George and the band? And I was amazed when I found out that you had produced everything because I remember seeing your name on the record saying produced by Steve Levine.
Yeah, well, I started with them from day one before there was even a record deal. And I think
Wow.
we have a unique position, and I don't think it will ever be replicated. I have great working relationships with the artists that I have, but Culture Club is unique, and we're still great friends. And I was having this conversation only a couple of days ago with Roy because we're working on something new, and obviously the documentary's coming out imminently. It was previewed a few days ago at Tribeca. It's a fabulous documentary with the band's full consent and involvement. That's going to be
Wow.
on Netflix later in the year. And we were reminiscing about things, and it occurred to us, we've spent the larger part of our life as Culture Club and me as producer than we spent with our parents, if that makes sense, because we're all
Yes, yes.
and we started roughly when we were 20, so it's now 40 plus years. So the largest chunk of our life has been spent within Culture Club, and it's one of those things. It's unique. I think it's the same as perhaps the relationship that Sir George Martin had with the Beatles, or perhaps the relationship that Michael Jackson had with Quincy Jones. There's a few
Yes.
through history where producers have had long-term relationships with the artists that they've worked with, and those are very, very special, and they are unique.
And it all comes over in the production as well. As soon as you hear a particular song as well, you can go, that was produced by Quincy Jones or Steve Levine or, whoever.
That goes back to your very first question of the differences in sound between particular records. We all have a passionate belief in sound, and we also have certain types of sound that we like.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Sound can really hit you here when you listen to a record, whether it's a dance track or a ballad or whatever. And I think, as producers, we learn what those sonic things are that stimulate us.
Now, did you and the band have an idea of the sound you were looking for when going in the studio to record?
Not a very specific sound, but a more general thing, because we all absolutely adore the same types of music. So as a sort of template of things that we like. So, for example, we all love David Bowie, but we also all love Philadelphia International and all those soul records. We also love reggae. We also love the more experimental stuff, things like early Roxy music where the synthesizers were part of it. And as you said, Bowie and all those stuff. So it's really a melting pot of sounds. There are specific things. So, for example, Time Clock of the Heart absolutely is a Philadelphia style song. But we
Yes.
also really love groups like Shalimar and Leon Silver's production. So if you think of a track on Colour by Numbers like Miss Me Blind, not only is that a kind of homage to that sound, we were fortunate
Yes.
enough to have Jermaine Stewart do the backing vocals on that track.
Wow, amazing.
For the absolute anoraks, Jermaine Stewart is the high voice on things like Night to Remember. He's above Jodie Whittaker.
My goodness, amazing. Absolutely
Yeah.
amazing.
So there's your couple of little anecdotes for that.
Excellent. I was just watching something to do with Shalimar the other day, how they had so many changes in singers and things, but apparently they're trying to get it is perfect harmony again with Jodie Watley and such like. But there you go then. Yeah, great insight there from you there. Thank you very much. Now, did you have a feeling that Karma Chameleon would be a hit?
Yes, and I felt it very quickly because when we finished the backing track and the record company came down to hear it, I was kind of pushing the faders up. There's something about the melody of that that's haunting. So not the size of it, because obviously that went beyond what we ever thought, but it did feel like this is going to be a big record because we've come off the back of 2 or 3 hits by then. Because if you know, we had Do You Ready first of all, then we had Time, Church of the Poison Mind. So we'd already had several top 5 hits. George was in the ascendancy. However, it is an exceptional record, and it did sell beyond what we ever imagined. It sold over 1 million singles, just singles. So you can never predict those things. And of course, the likelihood of that ever happening again is almost impossible because
Yes.
the volume of those sales just don't exist anymore.
And was it your idea to have the harmonica on there?
It was because, and it's a very interesting...
Because it's very iconic.
Yes. So there's a couple of things about the harmonica. The harmonica first made an appearance actually on the first album, but not with that particular player.
Right.
And in the very beginning, the reason we put the harmonica on the first album was actually more to do with a sort of Western style.
Right.
However, we are all big fans, as I mentioned, of Motown and Philadelphia International. And I personally am a very big fan of Norman Whitfield.
Right.
Particularly Norman Whitfield's work with the Temptations in the later period of time, Psychedelic Shack, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
Ball of Confusion being one particular track that does have harmonica on it, as opposed to the Stevie Wonder style of harmonica, which is a chromatic harmonica. We didn't want that.
Yes.
What happened around the period of time with Karma Chameleon, we actually first drafted it with saxophone playing the lick.
Right.
Steve Granger, who was in the band, is a fantastic saxophonist, and had played the solo, for example, on Time. That's him playing. So we initially were thinking saxophone, but it kind of didn't sound quite right as saxophone. So I then said, well, why don't we because my original idea was to use Judd Lander for the saxophone. So my original idea was to use Judd Lander for the harmonica on Church of the Poison Mind. I'd known Judd at CBS Records because Judd Lander was actually a record plugger at CBS Records.
Oh, right. Okay.
And said to me, I play harmonica. And I'd seen him play harmonica. And I knew he was really good. So he played harmonica on Church of the Poison Mind. When we were at Karma Chameleon's stage, we thought, well, maybe we should do harmonica. So then I called Judd to do harmonica. But very few people knew that he played harmonica because he was still a record plugger at that point. And then, of course, George had him on Top of the Pops to play harmonica. So those early Top of the Pops scenes, the harmonica that's being mimed is by Judd. So it is actually the person that played it. So yes, it's a kind of a set of circumstances that led us to it. But I knew Judd from CBS, yes, so absolutely.
Absolutely fantastic. Sounds great as well. I love that harmonica. Yes, I have tried that myself, but I can't get away with it, unfortunately.
It is
too complicated.
No, people think it's really simple, but it's actually more complicated than people imagine.
It is, yes. You can watch all the DIY things on YouTube, but I still haven't picked it up. Now, do you prefer engineering or do you prefer producing, as they kind of go hand in hand?
In the 80s period, I probably was more predominantly the record producer, but in my current Baltic Jazz world, where this is my studio, I actually have a seamless role between engineering and producing. It's one and the same thing, because I'm thinking of it at a macro level in terms of what mics am I going to use on the drums to create the sound that we have. So, for
Yeah.
example, if we take Maevey's current single, So Glad, the drums are particularly important on that track in terms of the way they give the feel to the track. And also the sound of the drums was very, very important. Maeve and I had long conversations about what we wanted on that track. And we used our drummer, Vidor Norim, to play the drums. But they have a particular tone that really suits the track. And as it
Yeah.
turned out, I know everyone is going into this kind of retro recording and recording drums to tape and everything. But in truth, they were actually recorded very, very simply. Just good microphone placement, good dampening of the kit, very, very little tweaking, as in not lots of compression or EQ, the type of things you would normally do. It was a very natural sound, but I think it helped because Maeve and I were very specific to Vidor about what we wanted in terms of it, including the fills, actually, because he said, what do you want at the beginning? And I said, I want a very specific fill at the front. And I sort of went, I want, and then
Yes.
but what was funny, he went straight and he said, what, like this? And that was first take. And I went, yeah, exactly. So,
Excellent.
yeah, that was it. And we made a couple of little, after we did one take, we debated the take, and then there was a couple of minor changes that we made. And I think maybe only did maybe a maximum of 3 takes. It didn't take very long. I mean, maybe 3
No.
takes, no more, but it's fabulous, and it really complements the feel of the track.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about Maevey's brand new single in a moment from now, because it is absolutely an amazing track as well. Now, you have collaborated with artists and bands including The Honeys, China Crisis, Gary Moore, Ziggy Marley, Louise, The Creatures, The Angelic Upstarts, Lemmy and Motorhead, David Grant, Jimmy the Hoover, who was famous for the Tantalize there, of course. And, of course, we had Westworld, Zig Zig Sputnik. Oh, yes, remember that one. That was a big hit. Mystique, and, of course, the lovely 911 as well. Now, out of all of the collaborations that you've done with these artists and bands, Steve, I must ask you, if you're allowed to tell me, which band or artist have you had so much fun working with over your 50 years, not including Maevey yet?
Fun. I would actually say, obviously, it's separating Culture Club because that goes without saying. It was really incredibly lovely working with David Grant.
Right.
David Grant had just come off the back of a big hit with Lynx, but was going to make his solo record.
Yeah.
Those sessions were very, very enjoyable. Very enjoyable. We had lots of fun on those sessions. And his partner in crime on those sessions was David Grant's partner was Derek Bramble on those sessions. And David.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so the first sessions that David and Derek did together were as part of David Grant's solo record. Derek Bramble went on to be and is a phenomenal record producer, and his apogee was that he got to produce David Bowie.
Wow, that is absolutely amazing.
So, and I still speak to Derek regularly. I spoke to him only a couple of days ago, actually. So Derek is now a big deal in Los Angeles. He's produced many, many great tracks for Whitney Houston, and as I mentioned, the David Bowie was kind of one of those, but he's a fabulous performer, fabulous singer. And so those sessions were enjoyable because Derek was learning his craft. And just as I'd mentioned, actually, how Bruce Johnson had helped mentor me, Derek has acknowledged that there was a little bit of mentoring going on with me and him. And in fact, funnily enough, we were talking about a piece of equipment the other day, and he said, I've still got that in the rack, and I bought it after you had it, and it was really funny. So there's that love. So I would say that was quite a lot of fun. Yeah, that was fun. I enjoyed the Honeys, and I'm still very, very friendly with Selena to this, all of them. But in the case of Selena, we may have some exciting Baltic Jazz news with her very soon.
That would be excellent.
Maeve and I have been working with her recently on something, and we have something, in the early stages, but exciting news for Honeys fans or Selena fans.
Excellent. Yes, we'll look forward to hearing about that. Now, you worked with Ziggy Marley. What was your experience like, and did Bob make an appearance?
This was after Bob's passing, so
Right.
he was there in spirit.
Yes.
Ziggy was quite young, and it was a really interesting journey for me because I have a love of reggae music, and so to go to Tough Gong Studios, that was a real highlight. It really was,
I bet.
and to work with the musicians in Jamaica are exceptional, and they have, like every sort of studio area, they have musicians that they draw on regularly. So in the case of Tough Gong, they had their equivalent of a sort of reggae wrecking crew, a few drummers, a few bassists, and a few people they can call on whenever.
Right.
So we had Ricky Walters on bass and Grub Cooper on drums on those sessions, who are, for those that really know their reggae, will know who they are.
Absolutely fantastic. And what tracks did you produce with them? Was Tomorrow
album.
People?
It was the whole album. Well, I have got some tracks on that because essentially what happened was when I did my first album, which I think was called Play the Game, was the title. We did the album, and then some singles were released, and then another album came, and then things were edited together. So if you look at the tracks I produced, they're actually scattered all over the place.
They are, yes.
Yeah, so it's very hard to ascertain which records they're on. But the one that looks like a kind of like a sort of Ludo game, with the colour,
Right.
is the main album that I produced first. And but many of those tracks have been put on other albums that I didn't produce the whole album, but there's a couple of mine on it. So yeah, you have to kind of look on Spotify, and actually the credits have only just been corrected because for a long time I actually wasn't credited for any of it. So
wow.
Yeah, well, that's just the thing. But it has been corrected quite recently. So if you do search, you should be able to see the ones that I've done. Most of them are now correct, but not all of them still. But hey, that's the way it goes. Credit where due is very important.
It is very important. Yes, we need to get all of that altered there, definitely, as soon as possible, because Steve needs. I mean, but it affected your royalties at all? Will you have to get them backdated? Or is that another day?
Yeah. We'll leave that. We'll leave a line in that one.
We'll leave a line in that one.
Anyone that knows.
Exactly, Steve. Excellent. Now we're going to fast forward to 1994, where you actually were involved with an intriguing band that has not been mentioned in the list so far, which I've mentioned earlier, which was America, which I'm an absolutely big fan of, and I love all of their music. And you actually produced the album Hourglass alongside Jerry Beckley and Dewey Bunnell. What was it like working with them and re-recording the iconic You Can Do Magic?
Well, here's the thing. I met Jerry through a mutual friend in America. So Culture Club's original success, they were with an agency in America, and one of the chaps at the agency was their kind of go-to guy. I mean, it's quite an interesting way that American agencies work. You have the big cheeses, and then as you move down the food chain, you have the little cheeses.
Yeah.
So this particular, I won't say any names, but those that know who he is. I mean, he's lovely, and I saw him recently. He's fantastic. So this chap was fairly junior at the time. In fact, so junior that he actually picked me up from the airport a couple of times. But he was a big fan of Culture, a big fan of the work. He's now a massive deal in the entertainment industry. He's like a really big.
Wow, right.
He's pretty much top of the food chain at the moment, which we always constantly laugh about. So those that know will know who he is. And I love him to bits. We are still great friends. But he also knew Jerry really, really well. And so when I was in California, he said, I really think you get on like a house on fire. You should really meet up. So we met up, and we did. And we got on like a house on fire. And we've been friends ever since. And we'd actually recorded some tracks for soundtrack work and bits and pieces. Jerry's a fantastic singer. Also, Jerry has a great connection with the Beach Boys, and we also did the Beckley Lamb Wilson album, which I really wish people would listen to. There's some phenomenal stuff on that. So that's Jerry Beckley, Robert Lamb, and of course Carl Wilson. So the Beckley Lamb Wilson album,
amazing.
Search it out. It's really good, really good, and great vocals. And I love. That was kind of like the last great thing of working with the three of them. But we'd recorded a ton of tracks. And then when the Hourglass came, I haven't produced the whole of that album, but Jerry said, well, why don't we put these tracks within it? Because it makes sense within the the confines of that particular album, and they just done a new deal with American Gramophone, which is the label. So that's how it went. Yeah, I love it. I love that track to bits. I've actually got 2 or 3 others that I did with him that are still in the can that have never been released. So maybe one day we release those as well. Of equivalent standard, I have to say they're very, very good. It was just circumstance. There was no falling out. There was no technical reasons. We just did, they're just spare tracks. So I maybe we'll release them one day, but they're really good.
Yeah, you'll have to release them as maybe a bonus.
Yeah.
A bonus tracks,
Exactly.
And if it's all on vinyl, you could go, includes these bonus tracks.
I've just had a large chunk of my library transferred from physical tape to hard drive. So I've got most of those files now. It's just a question of time. It's really time consuming.
I bet it is, because you'll have lots of things that'll be on the shelf still, I bet, from all the artists that you've worked with.
I've got a pile of tapes taller than me that, it's hours worth. But obviously I'm concentrating now on making sure that my new stuff is. So, the only compromise I did make was that on the Baltic Jazz album, the track PCM was actually from a previous session. I took elements.
Yeah.
It's a new recording, but there's elements that I loved so much, and it sort of took me back in time, and I wanted that. So.
Yeah. But yes, your label is doing very, very well, and I'm going to speak about that in just a moment. But just let's rewind there, because you mentioned the Honeys there, and they were absolutely a fabulous group, and I played them loads on the radio as well. And but I mean, how did the collaboration come about in the first place, and what happened to them as they were doing so well? Because I was playing them on the radio, and all of a sudden, I was going, "But where's the Honeys?"
So that collaboration came about because I'd previously been working with Louise, and I did some tracks with Louise for her album. And their management was the same management. And so they were so pleased with what I did with Louise. And more importantly, they were pleased with my studio and my working relationship with Louise.
Right.
And they said, well, we've got this new group called the Honeys. In fact, they weren't called the Honeys, and they were called something else. They were called Essence or something like that. And we had a meeting, and I really remember the first meeting because it was really frosty, considering, Selena and I have been friends, for however many years it is. The first meeting was really frosty because they'd had really poor studio experiences with the previous writers and producers that they'd worked with. And I won't go into any more detail, but most people can imagine what possibly went on. It was just an unpleasant set of circumstances. So when their managers approached me, they said, Louise has been talking how wonderful it is working with you. And my studio at that time was in my house. And she said, Louise particularly liked the kind of friendly, home, safe surroundings and she felt very comfortable working there.
Yes.
I would think that the Honeys would do the same. But the first meeting was quite frosty and it was a bit odd. But eventually it warmed, and then, the rest is history. We started working together, and the moment we started working, we had a really lovely working relationship. And then the record ended up being more successful than anyone imagined, because they were actually, as was very common in those days, there was a lot of work for artists to go and do these kind of club tours where they might have a backing track and do live vocals and go to 2 or 3 a night. It was very popular then. So they had a load of bookings to do that because obviously they're very glamorous girls, and it went down well. And they happened to do one in Australia, believe it or not. And that we had then finished the record. And I don't know whether Selena had a CD or maybe even a test pressing, because this was the beginning of CD being the dominant force rather than vinyl. Yeah. So they may well have had I seem to remember, because I've been going through my archive, I remember them doing a limited edition DJ promo CD that was only maybe a few hundred, but it was in a really big like a honeycomb thing. I've got one of those.
Yeah.
I think that's what Selena had with her, and she played it to somebody like yourself on the radio privately, and they broadcast it because it wasn't to be broadcast.
Yeah.
And mad, literally exploded overnight. So in the time it took them to get back to England, it was already kind of making waves in Australia, so they were forced to release it really quickly, and so it zoomed up the charts. The reason it broke up was pressures from the label, pressures from outside forces, personal pressures. They are still friends. They all speak to they all, but just on a working relationship, it couldn't continue as it was. And I don't believe they had the best of record deals. I don't think they were getting value for money, and it was making it really expensive. But Selena does tour with versions of the Honeys with whoever's available at various. There's a lot of cruise ship work and a lot of those Butlin style venues. So she's still busy touring as the Honeys. Sometimes it's with Mariama, sometimes with her own daughter. It just depends on what's available and the funds and everything. But as I said, we've been writing some new material, and watch this space.
That would be absolutely excellent. Yes, okay, with the honey's absolutely amazing, and yeah, we will have to watch out for music coming along there from your new label, which we'll be talking about in a second from now. We're going to go back in time just a little bit because we're going to take you back to 1984, where you were awarded the prestigious Brit Award. And among the nominees were Peter Collins, Steve Lillywhite, Trevor Horn, Alan Winstanley, and Clive Langer. Now, what was it like getting the award at the time and being nominated alongside your peers as... and it was for your producing of Culture Club, wasn't it?
Predominantly Culture Club. I had obviously at that point also had the beginnings of success with David Grant, because he had some big hits. So it was kind of more general. But yes, you're absolutely right. It was a fabulous award. They've just announced that the Brits is now going to be in Manchester next year.
Yes.
But they ran vintage footage, and it's interesting because I won in 1984. And that was the last year before it was televised. The very next year, 85, was the first of the televised.
Oh, no.
So, although I have a lovely picture of Sir George Martin giving me my award, it wasn't televised. It was a private event. It was excellent. And the sweetest thing, and I've been thinking about this over the last sort of few weeks as I've been putting together this show, Trevor Horn phoned me the next day and said,
right,
which I think, Trevor and I have a great relationship, and we've sort of known each other over the years on a producer level, a personal level, and also on a technical level. There's a whole nother program about our technical conversations. However, he phoned me the next day, which I really cherished, and I thought that was really, really sweet of him to say, congratulations, you really deserve it, and we're both fans of each other's work.
Absolutely amazing, that as well. Yeah, I would have been elated myself, of Trevor Horn of all people. Absolutely amazing. It's great that you're friends still as well.
Yeah.
That is just amazing down the line. Now, you also received a Grammy Award for your work with Denise Williams on her album Water Under the Bridge, featuring the big hit Never Say Never, which reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot Black Singles chart and number 23 on the Billboard Hot Dance Club Play chart. How did you find out you'd been nominated, and were you surprised you won?
Well, number one, I thank you for your research. That's excellent research. I'm very impressed. So, in terms of winning, I didn't know, which is really kind of annoying in hindsight. Not only did I not know, I don't actually have the little statue. I've got the certificate. I got a call out of the blue from Naris, which is the Grammy company, saying, "Oh, Steve, you've won a Grammy for your work with Denise Williams. Where can we send the certificate?" And I had no knowledge of any exactly. So it's the way it goes. I keep meaning to contact them and get the statue, because apparently you can get the statue, and actually they are doing another big run of statues, because unfortunately, so sadly, with the Los Angeles fire recently, many musicians and record producers have lost their awards. So I read somewhere that they are actually going to do another run of them so that they can get them back. So I might see if I can get one, because I've never had one. I mean, obviously I'm entitled to one, but I don't know. I mean, it might be sitting on a shelf somewhere. It's funny because a friend of mine also got a Grammy that same year. This is the most bizarre. I won't say who it is. He's quite well known. Really bizarre. He never knew he won. And he never got anything. He didn't even get the call that I got. And then somebody went to a boot fair in Banstead in Surrey, and it was on a boot fair stand, and he bought it and said to him, I won't say his name, "I've just found a Grammy with your name on it at a boot fair. I bought it for £7. Do you want it?" So
amazing.
How the hell did that happen? I'll tell Maevey, but yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
So, so thank you for your research. I love that record to bits. There's some moments on it, and yeah, I got a Grammy. I mean, lots of people that I've worked with, Culture Club have many Grammys, but they're not mine personally. They're for the band,
No.
the records I work.
Yes.
But that one is for my production work on that said track.
Yes, you'll have to get somebody to present the award to you, though. They'll have to do like a TV special, Steve Levine TV special with all of your artists, and then at the end they could go, and here's your Grammy.
Exactly. But I have the certificate on the wall of my studio.
Yeah. So, my goodness. I love that story. Great. Now let's get bang up to date. And after 50 years in the music industry, you have been a tape-op, engineer and producer, and now have launched your own record label, Baltic Jazz Recordings, which is a new label based in Liverpool. And the label is bringing a fresh, modern take on jazz, neo-soul, classic pop and lo-fi beats. What gave you the idea to start your label at this time in your career, Steve?
Well, it brings everything up to date. So I was in the middle of a BBC World Service documentary project, which involved BBC Philharmonic Orchestra. And just an adage to that, a few days ago, we won a gold award in the New York Radio Festival Awards for that very, very program, which is fabulous.
Wow, congratulations.
However, what happened during the recording sessions is that you have to book the BBC Philharmonic quite a long way ahead. And this was post-COVID, and the bookings for the Philharmonic were coming in fast and furious as venues were upscaling. And also, members of the Philharmonic play a lot of those Shakespeare in the Park style things, the summer events. So their director phoned me and said, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to postpone your recording session and pushed it further into the autumn. Is that okay? Because obviously the members want to earn some more money. And I said, absolutely. Which meant that in the month of August, that hot summer, I had 6 weeks of empty studio time because I had turned everything else down because I knew I had to do that. And honestly, Phil, it's so intensively focused, it's quite a lot of work, you're dealing with hundreds of players plus a choir. I wasn't doing the score or the parts, but it's a lot of logistics, so I don't have enough raw brain power to do anything else. You have to focus on that. It's really so consequently I went from hero to zero in a minute. I had nothing to do, so my wife said to me, well, why don't you use this time to do your own stuff? You wanted to do this for such a long time, so we thought do that. So initially the brief was to do just covers, just things where there was an element of connection with it. So hence we did Lois Levin was a cover of a Clash song. Neemax did a cover of a Culture Club song. I did some instrumental songs that were all songs that I'd worked with. And in fact, Maeve did one of the original tracks, but it was a cover that didn't quite suit her voice. So we sort of parked that to the next phase when we started doing original material. And so from that point on, we started doing only original material, working directly with the artists rather than just covers. And so the revisioned album that's out there is, instrumental and vocal covers, fabulous, my interpretations of those songs, giving but everything from that point onwards is new original material, working closely with the artists concerned. And Maeve and I had been working since lockdown on lots of different tracks. We have a good working relationship. We were introduced to each other through a mutual friend, and she was originally based in Wales. She's now based in Liverpool. And so we just kind of kept working and working and working. And then we decided the best way to do it would be to release an EP first of all. So we released the Revealed EP, which has 3 fantastic tracks on it. And to our surprise, it's very interesting. We love all the tracks individually, but Gatekeeper has been the surprise of that EP. It really has, so much so that we're actually giving that a bit of a refresh this summer, because only very recently, a dear friend of mine who's based in Ibiza, who manages a large number of influential DJs out there that that work at Passion, all those places, few weeks ago, he sent me a direct message and he said, I was at a family barbecue and I heard this track, Gatekeeper. They were just playing it. Is that yours? I went, yeah. He said, oh, we love it. We think we're going to feature it. And I went, oh my God, that's fantastic. So that is actually,
Wow.
and Maeve's here with me today, and we're just going to be finishing an edit on a quick Gatekeeper video to give it a little bit, because we've never done a video for it. So that's going to, and in parallel to So Glad, which is the current single, which we love to bits, and we mentioned about the drums and everything, we're going to sort of have like a parallel world where we're going to give Gatekeeper a bit of a push, because apparently, as we speak, there's some, trendy people in Ibiza love the track, and this is completely organically. It's nothing to do with
Yeah.
us. It just happened because people have listened to the record and love the kind of chill out vibe that it has, and it's definitely captured a vibe, that track. It really has. So that's what we have. So those are our two current tracks that we're pushing, and Maeve's So Glad, as I mentioned earlier, has gone on the Welsh A list, which is fantastic, and obviously with your support we'll get more. And the other
Yeah.
artist you mentioned, Jess Eady, her track has just yesterday went on the Jazz FM playlist, so that's again another neo.
Excellent.
She's more, if you think of the different divisions of the acts, I guess Maeve's got that more contemporary soul jazz flavor, and we
Yes.
really went to town on the jazz flavor with the Christmas record that was very jazz, but hers is more jazz. Jess is, because she's only just left university, she studied music at college, and she's quite young, and she uses a very modern approach with recording. She uses the Roland loop station, for example, as part of her work, because she's one of those
Right.
musicians. So we crafted that record very much in partnership, and she has a neo soul, kind of the neo soul lo-fi vibe. So that's given us the range of what you said in the intro of the types of jazz neo soul that we're doing, and
Yes.
hopefully more are coming through. There's lots of other artists that are approaching us that want to work with us, and in the case of Maeve, we mentioned Selena. There's a lot of other artists where there's a cross collaboration. So Maeve is working very closely with me. She's a fantastic songwriter, and so there's some other artists that maybe we bring into the fold that we will collaborate in a writing, vocal, there's lots of little silos that we can cross-pollinate the ideas with, and I think that's something that is not just with Baltic Jazz, but I think when you look at the charts at the moment and you look at the playlists on the stations, more than half are featured. It's blah blah featuring so and so.
It is. That's right.
Very much the way. Initially, it was only dance stuff. You'd have the I don't know, whoever your trendy dance person is. Calvin Harris featuring blah blah blah.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was very much that, where you had a DJ doing a backing track and someone guest vocaling. But
Yes.
what we're doing, and what many, many others are doing, is an organic collaboration from the ground up. And that's
Yes.
very much the current flavor at the moment, whether it's pop, jazz, or even indie stuff. There's a lot of indie stuff that has some cross collaborations of indie bands.
To have.
I think
That's right.
collaboration is incredibly healthy, because everybody benefits from the name checks. They benefit from the brand placement, and if they're then working on another project, they go, oh, so you're the person that did that. Oh, I heard your
Yes.
No, and I think it's very healthy.
Yeah, and also, it gives opportunity for acts to actually maybe change the style just for maybe one track, because they can be featured on a track.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's the thing that's happening with me the most with the artists that are approaching me. I have a couple in the works, which I won't mention now because it's too early days, but exactly what you've said. They have their own shape of sound, but they'd like to just skew it slightly and squeeze into the Baltic Jazz formula.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
a lot of it is people really love coming here and working in the studio. We've got a lovely, lovely working environment here. It's very, very sonically nice.
Yes.
It's a relaxing room, and I'm really pleased with the sound that we get here. It's maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but it's the sound that I love. It's a lovely room, and I love it.
Yeah, and the music sounds great coming from there. Now, your artists, Maevey and MT, have just released So Glad, which follows recently released tracks Forever and a Day and Futuristic, singles that are cementing Baltic Jazz Recordings as one of the most exciting merging labels in the UK right now. Now, how did you meet Maevey and MT? As I love Maevey's vocals on the latest track So Glad, which was my gem of the week just the other day on my breakfast show.
Well, she'll be very pleased that you love her voice that much, and that has been the comments that we've had. And I've just seen on my email another review has just come through. We've had some absolutely tremendous reviews that have really mentioned exactly what you've said, the quality and tone of her voice. And of course, I think what's very important is her lyric writing, because she's writing from a female perspective of the kind of troubles and aspirations that women of her age have. And I think that's why it resonates. So in terms of the progress, so we did the futuristic track. I'm a massive fan of Mama Terra. I think they're a fantastic band. And I met well, how it happened, I was listening to the track on the radio and I just thought, oh, that's such a great track. That's such a great. I did some research. Who are the people involved in it? Turns out there's this guy called Marco. He's the sort of, brains behind it. But Marco also has some other projects as well. And I think what had happened was he liked something I'd posted from one of the other tracks.
Right.
On the album. I then sent him a direct message and I said, you know what, it'd be great to collaborate on something. And he said, I'd love to collaborate. We also have a mutual friend in common who then said to me, you should really collaborate with him. And I said, you'll never believe it. We've literally just sent each other an email and we're going to have
amazing.
Going to come, because he's based in Glasgow. He's going to come down
right.
Have a practice day to see what happens. Well, in that practice day, he's such a great keyboard player. We came up with 3.5 great ideas.
Right.
One of them had something special. And then I was working on something else with Maeve and she said, oh, that sounds really good. So we then did a FaceTime with Marco in Scotland and said, look, we've got this, slight curveball here, because it was going to be an instrumental. It was never intended to be, a vocal record. We were going to go sax, or we weren't sure, but we loved what we had. And Maeve came up with this phenomenal top line, which then he ran with it, and he then came up with some other bits. And so it's a really great, what I said earlier about collaboration, each person stimulating the other person to come up with another idea. And that absolutely is a three-way for who had the best ideas. It's fantastic. And one of the things that I will point out is in the middle section, there's some vocoder, and that's him singing with Maeve with vocoder. So you got the two.
Right.
So that was fabulous. And separately to that, some of the members of the circle we work with Liverpool's a small city and everybody knows each other. So I had two strange sliding doors moments. First of all, Jack, our keyboard player, who plays with China Crisis, and Vida actually plays with China Crisis today.
Right.
Have you thought of working with MT Jones? Because he's really near here. He used to live like 3 minutes from the studio. And I said, no, but I do like his stuff. And then totally separately, I've been producing this indie band called Hush Tones, who I don't know if you're familiar with their stuff. They've got a new single out now, and the album's coming out soon. So Hush Tones are a 5-piece band, but Martha, the lead vocalist in Hush Tones, she has known Mikey, I'm going to say from school, but quite a long time.
Yes.
She said the same thing. When she heard, I think she heard one of the tracks I was doing with Maeve when I was mixing, because they came by to drop something off. I'd lent them, I think I'd lent them a keyboard or something. Anyway.
Right.
And they were listening and she said, you should check him out. He'd be great. So then it was one of those things where I sent him a direct message and he said, yeah, I'll come by and have a listen. So we spent the first day actually not doing any music, but just playing music, because he was also a massive fan of my radio series, The Record Producers. And he was about to go on tour with Jalen Nagonda, who also is from Liverpool, although he's American. He went to Lipper, and Jalen actually was one of my. I did a project a a couple of years ago, and Jalen was one of the musicians on it. He's a fantastically talented guy. Oh my! When he walks through the door, that look that he has is how he turned up at the studio. And he's such a, oh my God, he's so talented and such a great. You get star quality walking through the door. That's quite rare. He had that vibe from day one, and he's fantastic. Anyway, so he went to LIPA and studied there. So I gave Mikey some of my radio shows, and he listened to them on the plane, and then we set a day to do some sessions. So that from those original sessions, Forever and a Day came, which I absolutely love, and I'm so proud of that track. It sounds so beautiful. And then Maeve, she won't mind me talking because she's right here, said, that sounds like Time Clock of the Heart, but for today, which I think is a great.
Wow. It is lovely.
Time Clock of the Heart is one of my favorite Culture Club tracks, but it has the same sonic DNA, obviously.
Yes.
And Roy said to me from Culture Club, because I played to him, he said, that's such a Steve Levine track, that voice, because he sort of said that. He says that occasionally to me once. He once famously said that he thought I did Holiday by Madonna, because he said, that really sounds like you made that. Which actually, if you listen to...
That's really good.
Listen to Holiday by Madonna and you listen to the early Culture Club tracks, it's quite, there is quite a similarity. I don't know whether they copied, maybe they copied me, but when he first heard it, did you do that? It really sounds like you. Anyway, so then we decided to collaborate together, the three of us. So Maeve was the instigator in that, and took a very strong role in making sure that the melody and the lyrics were absolutely correct, which is why it's very much Maevey featuring MT Jones, because he's singing on the track and he's played some of the instruments, but it is an ensemble affair. In fact, there's also this fantastic extra singer called Kelly, who we discovered actually through Maeve's keyboard player, Sarah, recommended her to us, and we've used her not on this, just on this track, we've used her on some other things as well. So that's the other thing of the collaboration, that someone else recommends someone else, who recommends someone else, who recommends someone else, and that's where we are with the track. So it's a hybrid of bits of me, bits of her, bits of some others, but I think it's really fabulous. So it's a great track, and it's resonating really well with people, and some of the hosts that have played it said it sounds like a wedding song, which I love that, because it absolutely goes back to the DNA of Finally Found. Finally Found is a wedding song. Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
Selena's, we're very proud of the fact that Finally Found is, and Maybe So Glad is my 2025 wedding song, and there's nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah, it is a beautiful song, that one. Absolutely love it. Now, the sound of is so good on the rhythm, but I hear the horns were laid down in Chicago by Paul von Mertens at his studio. Was all this recorded live as one, or did he send the recording over for you to mix?
Yeah, exactly. So I've known Paul for more than 30 years. So for the full, those that read credits and soundtracks, Paul von Merten is Brian Wilson's musical director.
Oh my goodness, wow, that's amazing.
So if anyone's been to see Brian Wilson on the Pet Sounds or the Smile tours of recent years, Paul is the saxophonist, but also the musical director of the tours. And
amazing.
Has worked with Brian on and off. So I've known Paul for a long, long time. So when we first started the album of Baltic Jazz, I needed horns.
Yes.
And particularly I started off, I specifically needed the American style of horns, because one of the tracks I did was a Crusaders cover. And I phoned Paul and I said, Paul, would you be able to do this for me? I can send you, the backing track and you can do it. On the album, I have used Paul, and I have also used some local horn sections as well, who are also really good, who are actually friends of Jack. I mentioned Jack earlier, the keyboard player.
Yes.
So so I've used his friends as well, who play on sections. But Paul started on the album and carried on. So then when we did Forever and a Day, Paul played on that, but Paul also has played the horns on Gatekeeper. Now the horns on Gatekeeper are absolutely phenomenal, because those that know about brass arranging, on Gatekeeper there's also bass trombone, which is that lovely low sound, which is from the jazz era. those that love things like, Love Supreme and all those great tracks, the bass trombone, very, very special sound. And so it's a combination of Paul, a couple of friends of his that are in a little section. He has a flexible horn section depending on the needs. So I love those bits, and so that worked so well on Gatekeeper that we decided to put horns on Forever and a Day. So he did the horns on that, and then when we came to So Glad, he did the horns on that. So we send him. What we do is we send him the track. We then do a live FaceTime where we discuss what we want and we run through a few ideas, and he makes some notes because obviously being a musical director you can write, and he then records it. And because of the time difference, it allows him to record when we're asleep. And the next day it arrives on my desktop and I put it back into my master, and then we mix and edit accordingly. And sometimes there's bits I change around. And this is exactly the same with the strings. There's not strings on So Glad, but there are strings on Gatekeeper and strings on Forever and a Day, which Richard Mainwaring does in Wales. So he's a I send those to him, same thing. It's so on all of our recordings from the very beginning to today, they're all real instruments wherever we want real instruments, or they're specifically samples if we specifically want samples. I have no barriers with that. So on Jess Edie's records, those are specifically samples because that's specifically what I wanted to do to get the lo-fi way. On Maeve's track, those horns are 100% humans playing parts, and also the way Paul works is he plays all the way through, so they're not even copies. He's so great. He's so great.
It sounds fantastic on there as well. That's why I featured on me Saturday breakfast show just the other day there on Phil Wilson in the morning, and it went down a storm as well. So we'll keep really on.
That's lovely to hear. It really is.
Yes, as soon as I received it, I said that's got to be the gem of the week. We'll move the other one that I had out of the way. So there you go then.
I would be very pleased to hear that.
Yes, absolutely fantastic. Now, is there an album in the pipeline or any appearances that you could tell us about with me?
No, there isn't, but I would love that to happen. I mean, we've been debating as to how it would work. Obviously, with all the musicians involved, it's quite complicated for their time and everything. But yes, in an ideal world, like the old Motown Review show or the Soul, it would be great to do something like a core band and then all the guests, but that's down the line. At the moment it's a recording project, and that works really, really well. And at the moment it doesn't make any real economic sense to do an album. It's best to do it track by track, and as we do it. Having said that, track by track or EP by EP, Jess, I've done an EP because she's absolutely brand new and has never done anything like this ever before, so I the best way to do an EP, just as we did with Maevey in the beginning. Her first release for us was an EP. I think that's a better way of going, well, here's 3 ideas, concepts, but then single by single as we go. And then if we decide that we're doing well with something, then we'll expand it. But at the moment, everyone likes that individual thing. It gives people the ability to focus on individual tracks. Having said that, I have done an album with the Hush Tones because that's an indie band, and that's the reverse of everything I've just said. An indie band, fans want an album and they want an actual physical album, and we are actually doing vinyl. And I saw a mock-up of their vinyl which is coming out in September the other day. It looks fantastic. So in an indie world, you want a physical thing that you can hold, and you want an album, but in this world it's fine as we're doing.
Yes, mentioning vinyl there, I'm going to be asking you a vinyl question in a moment from now. And yes, if you've got any vinyl there that you're releasing, if any of your artists are releasing on vinyl there, yes, please drop them over, and I'll put the needle on the record on Phil Wilson's Vinyl Revival. Well,
then I will absolutely get the Hush Tones to get in contact with you, because the moment it's available, they will 100% let you have a copy.
Yes, that would be excellent. Yeah, maybe with a little squiggle on as well there.
Absolutely.
For safekeeping. Now, do you have any future projects you can tell us about? As I hear hot off the press, which has just been a little dicky bird, spoke to me just a little while before coming to speak to you today, Steve. They've told me that you are about to work with the Beach Boys later this year. Can you tell us about that, or is it too hush-hush?
It's relatively hush-hush, but the principle is that it's the album anniversary.
Wow, yes. Oh, my goodness.
It would make sense to have another look at maybe some remixing, and maybe remixing as in restoration remixing, not dance remixes.
Yes.
It's just the word applies to two things. We're not going to be going "Nts, nts, 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 nts."
No, no, yes.
But the technology has moved on, and it was a cutting edge album at the time. I'd like to sort of have a new review. So watch this space, and as soon as it's available, I will get Lisa. I'll get Lisa to give you a call.
That would be fantastic. Yes, it'd be lovely to chat with you about that fantastic fantastic project. And you heard it first here with Phil Wilson, Chat with Celebrities, as well as Phil Wilson in the Morning and everywhere else that were available. Thank you very much, Steve. Now, the vinyl revival is here, so I must ask you, what was the first vinyl record you ever bought, and what would be your favourite album and track you would play me if you had a record player beside you?
Well, I do have a record player beside me. So my very first record that I bought with my own money,
Yeah.
very easy answer. That's Chicory Tip, Son of My Father.
Excellent tune. Love that tune. Dee, 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 dee.
Yeah, and obviously, with my producer's head on, I now know that absolutely was Giorgio Moroder and had synthesized. So I was drawn to that without really.
Right.
Obviously, I know that now, but at the time, I just loved the fact it had that quirky sound, which I now know is a mini Moog synthesizer, and it was probably, if not the one of the very first hit records or number ones that featured a synthesizer.
Yes.
A discography historian may correct me, but my understanding, it was probably one of the first number ones, if not the first number one with a synthesizer. It wasn't the first record with synthesizers, because I think that moniker actually goes to the Monkees and not the Monkees and not the Beatles.
Oh, right. Yes.
Very
Yes.
first use of a synthesizer on a record, but Chicory Tip, I think, is the first number one. Anyway, that was my first record I bought with my own money.
And what was your favorite album, would you say? 100%.
It has to probably be, if we're talking vinyl as opposed to
Yeah.
I would almost certainly probably say Stevie Wonder. And I would say that any of the sort of three albums are my favorites, talking Book Fulfillingness and Innovisions. And I constantly get drawn into those albums from time to time. So if there's a track that you want to play, play You've Got It Bad Girl.
You've Got It Bad Girl. Great choice.
And there is a similarity with that, because there is a lovely synth sound on that record, which is an ARP 2600, which I have behind me there.
Right, right.
And if you listen to Forever and a Day, the synthesizer has a similar sound. That was something that I discussed with MT Jones, and he said, "Oh, I really love that sound. Do you know what it is?" And I said, "Yeah, it's ARP 2600." And I managed to get the sound. He said, "How do you know how to do that?" I said, "Well, I know how to do it." So the sound on Forever and a Day is a homage to
Yes.
Got It Bad, but it is made on my synthesizer right here. I know how to make that patch. And in fact, I did give him a copy of it, because he said, "Oh, I love that so much. Could I have that patch as a software instrument?" So I made it for him. Yeah, which is but yeah, it's a great sound. So maybe that one, does that fit in with your schedule and your?
It certainly does. That certainly does. That's an absolutely great suggestion there. Great track there. Never been mentioned before, that one. Now, where can listeners follow Maevey and MT and buy the music?
Well, I guess the best is to go to Spotify for the music and follow Maevey on Instagram. And if you just type her name in, or if you go backwards and you can find Baltic Jazz, they're all linked together. So Maevey's on Instagram and all the social things. Follow her on her own Spotify page, as well as the Baltic Jazz one, of course. And watch for updates, because we've got lots of exciting things happening in the next period of time.
Hello, Maevey. How are you doing?
Thanks. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you very much. Would it be possible for you to introduce your latest single, Maevey, which is with Maevey and MT? So Glad.
Yes, this is So Glad by Maevey, featuring MT Jones, and on the wonderful Baltic Jazz Recordings. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us on the show. And if you stick around, we'll have a little bit of a chat afterwards. But would you like to come on the show again, or have I frightened you away?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Phil. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No problem at all. We'll catch up with you soon, and all the best with everything that you do. And we'll catch up with you maybe soon about something to do with the Beach Boys. See you soon.
Bye.